People rarely create distance in a sudden or obvious way. Separation usually develops gradually, without a clear moment where everything changes at once. Contact may still continue, conversations may still happen, and interactions can appear stable from the outside. At the same time, something begins to shift beneath that surface. Responses may become slightly shorter. Engagement may feel less consistent, and the overall tone of the interaction starts to change. These differences are often small. They do not interrupt the relationship immediately. Because of this, they are easy to overlook. Nothing feels urgent, and nothing clearly signals that something is wrong. The interaction continues, but it carries less weight than before. Moments that once felt natural may begin to feel slightly distant. The change is not strong enough to be clearly identified, yet it is consistent enough to be felt. This is what makes the experience difficult to recognize in real time. From your perspective, your behavior may not appear different. You are still present, still communicating, and still participating in the same way. However, the response you receive begins to change in subtle ways. There may be less initiative, less depth, or less continuity in how the interaction unfolds. This creates a sense of confusion. It can feel as though the distance appeared without a clear reason. Patterns like this are not random. They are formed through small behaviors that repeat without being noticed. Each behavior may seem minor on its own. When they occur consistently, they begin to affect the interaction. This is where distance begins to form. Distance in relationships rarely appears without progression. It tends to follow a sequence, even if that sequence is not clearly visible while it is happening. At the beginning, nothing seems different. Interaction continues, and the connection appears stable. Then a slight change begins. One person may respond a bit less, share a little less, or engage with less consistency. This does not immediately affect the relationship. It feels like a variation, not a shift. As similar moments repeat, the pattern becomes more noticeable. Engagement becomes less frequent. The interaction loses some of its depth. The connection begins to rely more on routine than on genuine involvement. This stage often passes without direct acknowledgement. Neither side clearly identifies it as a problem. The relationship continues, but the quality of connection changes. Another stage follows. Initiative begins to decrease. One person may stop reaching out as often, or may respond without extending the interaction further. At this point, the distance becomes more defined, not through conflict, but through reduced presence. The final stage is not always a complete separation. In many cases, the relationship remains, but at a much lower level of connection. Interaction becomes occasional, surface level, or purely situational. This entire progression can happen without a clear turning point. Each step feels small. Together, they create distance. The shift often begins with behaviors that do not seem problematic when viewed individually. There may be no conflict, no clear mistake, and no obvious reason for someone to pull away. Interaction continues, and nothing appears wrong on the surface. At the same time, certain patterns start to influence how the interaction is experienced. One example is inconsistency in attention. Being present in some moments and distracted in others can create an uneven experience for the other person. It does not stop the interaction, but it changes how reliable that interaction feels. Another pattern involves how responses are given. Replies may be accurate and appropriate, yet lack extension. The conversation moves forward, but it does not deepen. This can create a sense that the interaction is being maintained rather than developed. A different pattern appears in emotional availability. When internal responses are not clearly expressed, the interaction remains at a surface level. The other person receives information, but not a clear sense of your engagement. None of these behaviors appear strong enough to create distance on their own. They are subtle. They do not interrupt the relationship directly. When they occur repeatedly, they begin to shape the overall experience. The interaction becomes less engaging, less consistent, and less connected. This is how the initial stage of distance begins to form. Small behaviors gain influence through repetition rather than intensity. A single moment of distraction, a brief response, or a lack of emotional expression does not define a relationship on its own. It passes without leaving a noticeable impact. The shift begins when similar moments continue to appear in a familiar pattern. What once felt minor starts to create a sense of predictability within the interaction. A tension that moves inconsistently introduces a feeling of uncertainty. Responses that do not develop the conversation limit how much depth can form between two people. When emotional signals are not clearly expressed, the interaction remains present but does not feel fully engaging. None of these elements need to be strong to affect the relationship. Their influence comes from how often they occur and how consistently they shape the interaction. As these patterns continue, the overall experience begins to change in a gradual way. The interaction may still function, but it carries less stability and less sense of involvement than before. Engagement becomes lighter, and the connection feels less grounded in shared presence. Another important detail is how these patterns are processed. People rarely analyze each moment one by one. What is felt is the direction the interaction is moving toward. That direction influences how much attention and energy they continue to invest. Instead of pointing out the change directly, behavior adjusts in a quiet way. Engagement becomes more limited. Participation becomes more reserved, and the interaction slowly loses its depth. This is how distance begins to form through accumulation rather than a single event. Distance is often created without direct explanation. In many cases, People do not clearly express what feels different or uncomfortable in the interaction. Instead of pointing to a specific issue, they adjust how they engage. This response is not random. It reflects how most people manage subtle changes in connection. Expressing a concern requires clarity, timing, and the expectation that the conversation will lead to a useful outcome. When the change in the relationship is gradual and difficult to define, those conditions are not always present. As a result, the response shifts toward behavior rather than explanation. Engagement becomes more selective. Responses may become shorter or less frequent. Initiative may decrease without being directly addressed. These changes communicate something, even if nothing is said explicitly. Another factor is that direct communication can feel unnecessary when the difference is not strong enough to justify confrontation. The interaction still functions. There is no clear conflict. What is missing is a sense of depth or consistency, which is harder to describe in precise terms. Because of this, the adjustment happens quietly. The other person reduces their level of involvement instead of trying to define the issue. This allows the relationship to continue, but at a different level. Distance forms through this gradual reduction in engagement, rather than through a clear decision to step away. People do not rely only on what is clearly stated when they decide how to engage in a relationship. A large part of their response is shaped by how the interaction feels over time. This feeling is not always verbalized or analyzed in detail. It forms through repeated experiences that create an overall impression. When the interaction feels consistent, engaging, and responsive, the tendency is to remain involved. When it feels uneven, limited, or unclear, the response begins to change. This process does not require a clear explanation. The system evaluates the interaction based on how it is experienced, not only on what is explicitly communicated. Because of this, behavior often follows feeling before it follows reasoning. A person may not be able to describe exactly what feels different. At the same time, they can sense that something has shifted. That sense is enough to influence how much energy they invest. Another important point is that this evaluation happens continuously. Each interaction contributes to the overall perception. When similar patterns appear repeatedly, the feeling becomes more stable. Once that happens, behavior begins to align with it. Engagement decreases, not as a deliberate decision, but as a natural adjustment to the experience of the interaction. This is how distance can form without a clear explanation being given. A feeling does not remain vague when it is repeated. What begins as a slight sense of something being off gradually becomes more defined through consistent experience. Each interaction adds another layer. At first, the difference may not be strong enough to influence behavior. It is noticed, but not acted on. As similar experiences continue, that feeling becomes easier to recognize. It starts to form a stable perception of the relationship. This perception does not rely on a single event. It is built from the accumulation of small signals that point in the same direction. Once this perception becomes stable, behavior begins to align with it more clearly. The other person may not analyze the situation in detail. They do not need to identify a specific cause. The overall sense of the interaction is enough to guide their response. Engagement becomes more selective. Attention is directed elsewhere more often. Energy is invested in interactions that feel more consistent or more engaging. Another important detail is that this shift often happens quietly. There is no clear moment where the perception is confirmed. It becomes stronger simply by repeating the same experience. As a result, the distance that follows feels gradual and natural from their perspective. It reflects the way the interaction has been experienced over time. The quality of an interaction is not determined only by what is said, but by how the experience unfolds across multiple moments. People respond to patterns that shape the overall interaction, rather than focusing on isolated actions. One important signal is the stability of attention. A steady presence creates an environment where the other person can remain engaged without effort. In contrast, shifting or inconsistent attention introduces a sense of uncertainty, even if nothing is directly addressed. Another factor involves how conversations move. An exchange that builds naturally, where ideas connect and develop, supports a sense of continuity. A conversation that remains at a surface level without progression limits. How much depth can form between two people? This does not depend on complexity. It depends on whether the interaction creates a sense of movement rather than repetition. Emotional clarity also influences how the interaction is experienced. Reactions, tone, and subtle expressions provide signals that help the other person understand your level of involvement. When these signals are difficult to read, the interaction can feel neutral or distant, even though it continues. These elements are not usually analyzed in a conscious way. They are felt as part of the overall experience. From that experience, a general perception of the interaction begins to form. That perception influences how much energy someone chooses to invest moving forward. As similar patterns continue, the sense of connection adjusts accordingly. Patterns begin to shape expectations once they repeat enough times. A single interaction can be ignored or forgotten. Repeated experiences start to form a sense of what will happen next. The other person begins to anticipate the tone, the depth, and the level of engagement before the interaction even begins. That anticipation influences how the relationship is approached. When the expected experience feels limited or inconsistent, engagement begins to adjust ahead of time. Less attention is given and less energy is invested from the beginning of the interaction. This shift develops gradually through repeated exposure to similar experiences. No clear decision is required for this adjustment to take place. It forms as a natural response to what has been felt multiple times. Another important factor is how expectation simplifies future behavior. Once a pattern becomes familiar, there is less need to evaluate each interaction from the start. Previous experience becomes a reference point. That reference guides how much effort is given without requiring conscious thought. As this continues, lower engagement becomes easier to maintain. The interaction begins to settle into a predictable level of involvement. There is less variation, less spontaneity, and less depth in how the interaction unfolds. This predictability reduces how much attention is naturally invested. The relationship starts to feel more defined, but also more limited. Distance becomes part of that structure. It is no longer a temporary reaction. It becomes a consistent way the interaction is experienced. As the pattern continues to repeat, it becomes more difficult to change because it is already supported by expectation. Once expectation settles into a stable form, the relationship begins to follow that structure with less variation. Interactions no longer feel open or flexible. They start to move within a narrow range that has already been experienced multiple times. This creates a sense of predictability. Predictability can feel comfortable in some situations, but in this context, it reduces engagement. When the outcome of an interaction feels already known, there is less reason to invest attention or effort. The interaction continues, but it carries less curiosity and less involvement. Another important shift appears in how energy is distributed. People naturally direct more attention toward interactions that feel responsive and engaging. When a relationship begins to feel limited in those qualities, attention starts to move elsewhere. This does not happen abruptly. It develops through small adjustments in where time and focus are placed. The relationship remains present, but it is no longer a priority. This change can be difficult to notice from the inside. Communication still exists. Contact has not disappeared. At the same time, the depth and frequency of engagement continue to reduce. The structure holds itself in place through repetition. Each interaction reinforces the same level of involvement. Without a change in that structure, the pattern continues. Distance becomes a stable condition rather than a temporary phase. Restoring a relationship becomes difficult once a stable perception has formed. The interaction is no longer experienced as something new each time. It is filtered through what has already been learned. Each new moment is interpreted in the context of previous patterns. This makes change harder to recognize. Even when behavior begins to shift, the existing perception can remain in place. The other person continues to expect the same level of engagement and the same type of interaction. This expectation influences what they notice. Subtle improvements may not register immediately. Attention remains focused on what has been consistent in the past. Another factor is how slowly perception updates. It is not adjusted based on a single interaction. It requires repeated experiences that differ from the established pattern. Until those experiences accumulate, the original perception continues to guide the interaction. This creates a delay. Behavior may change, but the response from the other person does not shift at the same speed. This gap can feel discouraging. It may seem as though the effort is not having an effect. In reality, the structure is still adjusting. Perception follows consistency. Without enough repetition of a different pattern, the existing view of the relationship remains stable. A shift in perception requires more than a single change in behavior. What matters is the consistency of a different experience across multiple interactions. One interaction can be seen as an exception. Repeated interactions begin to challenge the existing pattern. The system starts to register that the interaction is no longer the same as before. This does not happen immediately. It builds through exposure to a new structure that appears again and again. Consistency plays a central role here. When engagement becomes more stable, attention becomes more present, and responses carry more depth, the interaction begins to feel different. That difference needs to be experienced multiple times before it becomes recognized as a pattern. Another important detail is that the change must be clear at the level of experience, not only at the level of intention. Effort that is not visible in the interaction does not influence perception in the same way. What the other person responds to is what they experience directly. When the interaction begins to feel more consistent, more engaging, and more responsive, perception starts to adjust. This adjustment is gradual. It follows the same structure that created the distance. Repetition forms the pattern, and repetition changes it. As the new experience becomes more familiar, the expectation begins to shift. That shift opens the possibility for the relationship to move in a different direction. Not every change in behavior leads to a noticeable change in how the interaction is experienced. Some adjustments remain too subtle or inconsistent to be recognized as meaningful. What influences perception is not the intention behind the behavior, but the clarity of the experience it creates. A noticeable shift often appears in how attention is felt during the interaction. When attention becomes more stable, the other person can sense a more consistent presence. This does not require intensity, it requires continuity. Another important element is how the interaction develops. An exchange that builds, connects ideas, and moves forward creates a sense of involvement. This allows the other person to feel that the interaction is progressing rather than repeating. Emotional clarity also contributes to this change. When reactions and engagement are expressed in a way that can be understood without effort, the interaction becomes easier to connect with. Unclear or neutral responses make it harder to interpret the level of involvement. These differences are not analyzed in a deliberate way. They are felt as part of the interaction. From that experience, a new perception begins to form. When the interaction consistently carries these qualities, the shift becomes recognizable. This is where perception begins to update, not through explanation, but through experience. A change can begin to appear, yet it does not always remain stable without consistent support. New patterns may show up in certain moments, then fade when conditions shift. This fluctuation is part of how behavior adjusts. A pattern that has been repeated for a long time still exists in the background. It can reappear when attention drops, when energy is low, or when the interaction becomes less intentional. Situations that feel familiar often trigger the same responses that were used before. This happens without a clear decision. The system returns to what is easier to execute. Another important factor is how consistency is maintained. If the new behavior depends on effort alone, it becomes difficult to sustain across different situations. Effort changes depending on context, energy, and focus. When effort decreases, the previous pattern becomes more accessible again. This creates an unstable cycle. Change appears, then disappears, then appears again. From the outside, this can look inconsistent. From the inside, it feels difficult to control. Stability requires something different. The new pattern needs to become easier to access than the old one in the situations where it matters. Without that shift, the system continues to move between both patterns. Stability develops through how moments of regression are handled, not by avoiding them completely. A previous pattern can reappear even after progress has been made. This does not erase the change. It reveals where the pattern is still active. What matters is the response that follows. If a return to the old pattern continues without interruption, it reinforces the same structure again. If the shift is recognized early, the interaction can move in a different direction before the pattern fully develops. This requires attention to timing. The sooner the change is noticed, the less influence the old pattern has on the interaction. Another important detail is how the situation is interpreted. Seeing these moments as failure creates unnecessary tension. That tension makes it harder to respond clearly. A more effective approach is to treat them as part of the process. They provide information about when and where the pattern still operates. This allows for more precise adjustment. Instead of trying to control every interaction, focus shifts to responding within the moment. Small corrections, applied consistently, prevent the pattern from extending. Over time, this reduces how often the old structure takes hold. Stability is formed through repeated redirection, not through perfect consistency. The pattern becomes clearer when the interaction is viewed as a sequence. It is not made of isolated moments. Each part influences what follows. A small behavior appears, and that behavior shapes how the interaction is experienced. That experience then affects how the other person responds in the next moment. This response carries forward and influences the next interaction as well. As this process repeats, a stable pattern begins to form. Several elements shape how this pattern develops over time. Inconsistent attention can introduce a sense of instability into the interaction. Conversations that remain at a basic level can limit how much depth is able to form. Emotional signals that are difficult to read can reduce how involved the interaction feels. These elements do not act independently. They combine and shape the overall experience in a cumulative way. That experience becomes the reference point used to decide how much to engage. As similar interactions repeat, a perception begins to take shape. This perception does not require constant evaluation. It operates in the background and gradually guides behavior. Engagement begins to adjust, and the amount of effort invested in the interaction changes along with it. The relationship starts to settle into a consistent level of involvement. Understanding this structure shifts where attention is placed. The issue is not a single mistake, but a pattern that continues to repeat across interactions. Changing that pattern changes the direction of the relationship itself. The direction of a relationship is shaped by patterns. Single moments do not define it. What repeats begins to define the experience over time. A simple principle can be used as a reference point in this process. People tend to move closer to interactions that feel consistent, engaging, and clear. They begin to move away from interactions that feel unstable, limited, or difficult to connect with. This shift does not depend on a clear or conscious decision. It develops through repeated experience across multiple interactions. Understanding this changes how the situation is approached. The focus moves away from trying to fix one specific moment. Attention shifts toward how the interaction is experienced over time. Small adjustments begin to have more importance in this context. More stable attention creates a clearer sense of presence within the interaction. Conversations that develop naturally create a sense of movement and continuity. Clear emotional signals make involvement easier to feel and understand. These changes do not need to be extreme or dramatic to be effective. They need to appear consistently across interactions. Consistency allows a different pattern to form and become recognizable. As the interaction begins to feel different, perception begins to adjust. That adjustment gradually influences behavior in a natural way. Engagement increases as the experience becomes more stable and more connected. The relationship begins to move in a different direction through this shift. Distance does not need to be forced to close directly. It changes as the pattern that created it is gradually replaced.